Hello, everybody. I'm here with Dr. Lorne Ladner, who's a friend, former colleague. We used to work together for close to 20 years or something. Dr. Ladner is a clinical psychologist who provides individual therapy, diagnostic assessment, family therapy. He's been holding a private practice in Centerville and over 18 years of doing, I think it's longer than that, isn't it, Lauren?
Yeah, close to 25, I think.
Yeah, it's a long time. Um, Dr. Ladner has authored many books and articles and chapters in books on psychotherapy. His book, The Lost Art of Compassion, Discovering the Practice of Happiness and the Meeting of Buddhism and Psychotherapy by Harper Publishers, has been translated into French, into German, some into Chinese, I think.
Partially.
Partially, partially into Chinese. Dr. Ladner wrote a chapter on mindfulness in the context of therapy and spirituality oriented interventions in counseling and psychotherapy, published by the American Psychological Association Press. And he produced a training video with Dr. John Carlson for the American Psychological Association entitled Mindful Psychotherapy. Dr. Ladner also co-authored Bridges of Compassion, Insights and Interventions in Developmental Disabilities with Dr. Alex Campbell. And he also has edited a couple of books for Wisdom publications, The Wheel of Great Compassion and The Easy Path, as well as many other things that aren't listed in this list. From 1999 to 2004, he was an adjunct faculty member at Argosy University. And since then, Dr. Ladner has given lectures, workshops on topics ranging from psychology of compassion, positive psychology, mental health, diagnosis and assessment, integrating meditation and psychotherapy, and mindfulness at a wide range of venues, including the Amiga Institute, the Virginia Psychological Association, the Maryland Psychological Association, the New York Open Center, the Psychotherapy Network Conference, and the National Institute for the Clinical Application of Behavioral Medicine. I'm running out of breath.
Enough.
The accomplishments are so vast. Dr. Ladner takes a compassionate, collaborative approach to psychotherapy, and depending on the needs of the individual, employs approaches including Jungian, object relations, cognitive behavioral, positive psychology, and mindfulness-based therapy, as well as insights from scientific research on emotional intelligence, empathy, compassion training, and neurobiology. So I'm really glad, Lauren, that you've agreed to this interview. The first question, how did you become interested in compassion development and in providing psychotherapy?
Actually, first, I'll just very briefly say that it's a pleasure to see you, Wilson, to do this with you. And I really feel grateful to you I've known you for about 25 years, and just I think you've been tireless and relentless in promoting decency and compassion and kindness in the world and in mental health. So I really appreciate that. In so many different contexts, you've done that. Regarding your first question, I guess for me, what struck me was that I didn't start out actually interested in compassion cultivation. I started out interested in meaning and wisdom. Like I felt that there was like a lack of wisdom in the world around me as a young person. That wisdom wasn't raised even as a question, and I couldn't think of role models of wisdom very easily. And so I was interested in sort of pursuing, how do you live a meaningful life, and how do you pursue wisdom in the world? It seemed a mystery to me. And as I began to explore that question, I guess what was funny was that what I discovered was that so I came to the question you asked about cultivation of compassion. What I sort of came to was, if you want to live a meaningful life, cultivating and developing compassion is the most effective in my experience, way to do that, or my view. And if you want to live a life that approaches wisdom, trying to live with compassion seems the most important part of that. So that was how I came to the interest, I guess, in cultivating compassion, was kind of in that indirect way. And then that became a central focus for me. And then becoming a therapist came later, I think, that, or similar timing. But for me, that was like, it was a similar point, I guess, which was, how do you have a work in this world, in this culture, where you're being able to explore questions of meaning, and explore how do you live a wise life. And that was, therapy was one of the few contexts where I felt like that could be explored in the context of a career explicitly. And so I think that was how how therapy, becoming a therapist, becoming a psychologist became of interest to me when I was young.
We've never had this conversation before,
No.
but as you were speaking, I've thought of how many parallels to my own journey into this profession. Exactly, we're living in a pretty crazy world, and you see all the horror that occurs because people aren't living mindfully or compassionately, or basically confused and overridden by their impulses. So anyway, a lot of common ground there.
Yeah.
So it leads to my second question. In your direct work with clients, what have you found out about self-concept, how it develops in people, and its impact on people's long-term health and mental health?
I'll share a few different experiences from working for many years as a psychologist on that struck me as you kind of raised. We started talking a little bit about just this as a topic. And one point that I'll make is that it's clear to me from my work that self-concept is both something, it develops both internally and interpersonally. So it's something that's, our self-concept is in us. It's our own internal sort of image of ourselves or sense of ourselves. But it also develops in our interpersonal context, of course, and those influence it profoundly, especially in childhood, but even in adulthood, they do. That's one point. And another point that I wanted to share, though, that really struck me, I was thinking back to like earlier in my career and sort of being amazed at, like, I guess one thing I was humbled by and really learned actually by doing this work is that how incredibly distorted people's self-concepts can be. And I hadn't really thought about that before, so like, and I remember early in my career, like working with people who had body dysmorphic disorder, right? Where their sense of their own body, you look at the person, you think, well, this person looks like this, and then they have this very clear internal sense they look like something completely different than what they look like. Or anorexia, of course, is another example, right? Somebody's extremely thin and sees themselves as overweight. But just as the story, when somebody's profoundly depressed, for example, like they're, I look at this person maybe and I think, wow, what a delightful, wonderful human being, and they see themselves and feel deeply convicted, a deep conviction that they have no value, or that they're terrible, or that they're worthless, or, and the opposite, you can sometimes you see people who come in with narcissism who are actually not a very kind, ethical person, and yet has a distorted concept that they're the best thing, best person on the planet. So what, I guess one point I wanted to share is just like, from my work as a therapist, it really taught me, and then I had to look at myself too, and everybody, we all can have these varying degrees of distortion in our self-image. And that just because you think you're a certain way doesn't really mean very much. It doesn't mean it's accurate. So those were some things that, like, I guess being a therapist actually taught me. And then in terms of your last part of your question about like what's helpful, I think there are two things I wanted to share about that. One is, I think the more realistic, sometimes our sense of our mind or our body or self is extremely distorted. And one thing psychology says, which is true, is that the more realistic your sense of yourself is, the better. If we can realistically see what we have to contribute and where our weaknesses are, what our personal strengths are, what our values are, our failings, our challenges. If we can see those things realistically, we, I think, do better in relation to ourselves and also in relation to others. And we have a better sense of how we fit with others. That's one point. So I think from a mental health perspective, one thing is to try to make our own sense of who we are in the world more realistic. But then there's another point, which I just also wanted to mention, which is, and then to hold any self-image lightly. Because the truth is that our self-image is whoever we think we are, our sense of self-concept. What's the word? I guess at the minimum, you could say it this way, is just a concept, and it's temporary, so people hold on, for example, it's obvious, right? But somebody thinks, oh, my self-concept, then I'm young. And then, of course, they don't stay young. Or somebody's self-concept is, I have this career. But then sometimes, they have to leave that career. And one area that can cause so much suffering, I think, is that when we hold on to a self-concept as if it's who we really are, or as if it's some kind of permanent or substantial thing, and we don't realize that self-concept is a concept, and that it can be valid, but it's always valid contextually and temporarily. So if I say, so for example, if I say I'm a psychologist, that's only true contextually and temporarily. I wasn't born a psychologist. If somebody does an autopsy on me after I'm dead, they won't find a single cell of psychologist there. It's just a label that's arose from getting a certain degree and passing an exam and having a certain work, but it's temporary and it's just a kind of conceptual label on a role. It's not fundamental to who I am, and nothing is actually the point. There is no self-concept that's permanent, or that's, I guess human is the closest we can come to, but even that ends when we die. So I guess also, so those were the two things. One is making sure our self-concepts are realistic, but another is the more we can be flexible and sort of recognize our self-concepts are concepts. They're useful at times, but not to over-identify with any given concept. Because also, even, as we move from one context to another, somebody who's a parent, a mother, then the next moment, they're CEO or something, like, in other words, those self-concepts are accurate contextually, but they're always in a certain context. And so if we hold on to them too rigidly, we end up, I think, suffering also.
Well, that hits the nail on the head as far as I'm concerned. It reminds me, I'm sure you're familiar with ACT, acceptance commitment therapy, and they have the whole approach to working with self-concept, self as context, right? That it changes over time as we do. And I agree, when you hold on too tightly, you get dragged. It's like a internal anchor that pulls you into whatever fixation you have about your self-concept. So having flexibility, that's my takeaway from what you said, and questioning it and being willing to adjust it as necessary over time. As a therapist, and I know that every day you get hit with people's hardest problems and their trauma and all the worst things that people encounter in life. And as therapists, we can sometimes feel helpless or overwhelmed. All sorts of problems like compassion fatigue, burnout, vicarious trauma. When those kinds of internalizations of the chaos that we're dealing with in our profession start to internalize, how do you move forward? How do you personally unlock yourself from whatever you've internalized and start to feel okay again?
One thing, I guess I'll share one point, which is I've found it humbling and helpful to recognize that, like, I think there was a time where I felt that was easier for me, and then I was recognizing since like the past few years of political unrest, extremism in our country, and the pandemic in our country, in the world, I was sort of going, wow, I found that harder actually, because of societal stresses, I guess, and also because sometimes the stress, I guess the traumas people were going through, I was going through too at the same time, or they stirred up my own. And then what's been helpful to me though, one is recognizing that that's normal, and that trauma shows up. I guess one thing I always say to patients, and I see it's true in me too, in all of us as human beings, is that trauma shows up in the body. It's partly a physiological reaction to certain experiences. And so I guess a few things as I thought about this issue are that for me, when I start to feel that kind of that vicarious traumatization or compassion fatigue or something, if it's connected to trauma, what I've started to notice actually is that taking care, I guess first point I'll make is one thing that's become almost like a mantra for me is self-care and other care are interdependent. And I find that's true for all of us, for all human beings, is that, if you want to be effective in taking care of others, you have to take care of yourself, and if you want to take good care of yourself, you also have to take care of others. They're both mutually interwoven, and you can't do one in the absence of the other. That's one point that's really been helpful to me to remember over and over. And then for me, as I think about that, a few things. One is I've recognized that I really do, when I'm feeling that way, need to take care of my body. And oftentimes it's been getting outdoors, getting in nature, exercising, walking, swimming, doing things where my body moves, eating healthily, and also like social connection and physical affection with people I care about and love. All those things kind of help on a I can actually, I can intellectualize about it, but the truth is I was like, just the other day I was feeling a little tired and went to the pool, swam, got out in nature, enjoyed the sun, came home, and I was like, oh wow, now I have more energy to actually do something meaningful. And so I was like, wow, you can't escape how your body is processing things is one point. So I wanted to emphasize the body part of it, exercise, movement. And then the other couple of things I guess I would share. Another is, and the research shows this is helpful, but I found it helpful to me too, is imagery. So working like to be honest, just cognizing about something doesn't, especially if it's connected to trauma, doesn't help me very much. But physical, so doing something for the body, but also visualization techniques really help because they affect the brain in a different way than words do. So I personally use a fair amount of visualization technique to process and be okay with difficult things. And then the last thing I would share is having a sense of agency. That I think when any of us gets overwhelmed or something, or overwhelmed or trauma triggered or just stressed out, it can be hard to recognize that we have a sense of agency and choices. And I sometimes do this with patients, but I'll do it myself too, is sit down and say, Jill, just say, well, what are the spectrum, the range of options you have? And at first it's easy for anybody to go, oh, I don't have many. And then if you say, no, that's not true, and you challenge yourself a little, you start to see there are a lot of options in any given situation. There's a lot, what can I control, in other words, and what are the list of things I could control? Maybe some I'm not willing to do it, but even just recognizing I have those choices and then choosing something. Could be something difficult and challenging, or it could be something easy, but it makes a difference actually to recognize, these are the things I can control, and not to focus on what I can't control, and then to actually do something, even if it's a small gesture or something bigger, but to actually do something in the interest of feeling a sense of agency, control, and influence in your own life. And especially when world events seem very big, it can be easy to get frozen and go, oh, well, they're so big, but it's like, well, what can I do? And to do something helps.
That is perfect advice. I find that too in the literature on burnout and compassion fatigue. A lot of it is when the helping professional or just the helping person feels helpless. That sense of helplessness in the face of suffering when you care can be debilitating. And it's wonderful advice. There's that old quote by Shantideva, if I can change the situation for the better, why get upset? if I can't change the situation for the better, what use getting upset? So it's kind of that simple but profound logic. Um, which brings me to my last question. Would you be willing to share a strategy with the people who will watch this for moving out of a damaged sense of self into a state of well-being?
I mean, there are a lot of such techniques, but I guess if I were going to suggest one for now, for this purpose, I would suggest one related to imagery, which would be, I'll go through three steps, I guess. The first step would be like to imagine yourself in the presence of somebody. I'm ending where I started with wisdom. So to imagine yourself in the presence of somebody who you think embodies wise compassion, and it could be, a religious figure, or it could be a scientist, or whoever embodies that for you. It could be some altruistic person, or somebody in your, it could be somebody in your personal life, or somebody you've read about. But to imagine yourself actually with them, and then I said three steps. So the first step would be not verbal. The first step is just to imagine them looking at you with eyes of love and compassion, sending you loving, accepting, compassionate energy, right, that accepts you as you are right now, and as you experience yourself right now. And actually to imagine the look in their eyes of love for you and acceptance of you. And to imagine them even maybe making a loving, compassionate gesture towards you. So it's an embodied, my point here is that it's an embodied sense of being present with them. But so and imagining, sort of feeling yourself as we do in the loving presence of another, who sees you accurately and accepts and loves you as you are. I'll just say also, try to notice how, if you try to imagine them looking at you with love, notice how it feels in your body. Right? Do you resist that, or do you open to it? Do you relax, or does it, just what does that bring up for you? The experience of being loved, actually. Of being accepted as you are. And then the second step is, as they continue to look at you with love, they remind you of self-images you may hold on to, from society, or from trauma, or from past difficulties. And they remind you that's not how they see you. That from the eyes of wisdom, right, from the eyes of loving, compassionate wisdom. So if there are things society or other people told you about yourself that hurt you, you imagine this person, an embodiment of wisdom, telling you that's not who you are. If there are ways you hold self-images towards yourself, or say self-critical things to yourself, or put yourself down, this person with love tells you that's not who you are. That's not true of you. That's a distortion. Let it go. I don't see you that way. And any distorted self-concepts, or trauma-based self-concepts, or self-concepts that come from unhealthy past experiences, they just invite you to relax, or to soften, to be flexible, and to at least, and if you're not willing to fully let them go, to at least a little loosen your grip on them. And then the last step I would suggest is, the final step is to have that person still looking at you with eyes of loving, compassionate acceptance. To just share one small point with you, something, right, about how that, how wisdom sees you from on the deepest level, right? So there are a lot of superficial self-concepts and superficial judgments, we can often focus on the superficial. Here, you're just letting that embodiment of wise compassion tell you one thing about yourself from a place of deep wisdom. And so I'll pause and give silence just for a moment. I want to ask you just to notice, like, if you imagine them speaking in their own voice, what do they tell you about yourself from that place of wise, compassionate acceptance? And then they thank you for listening, and you can thank them if you like for the interaction. And that's a kind of imagery-based exercise around self-image.
Very beautiful. What a great way to get right into the heart of it, because so often our superficial self-images arise in context of interaction, as you said, and when the interaction just causes us to distort the self-concept, it's really in a healing interaction that can heal. So what a beautiful way to do that, Lorne. Wonderful. I'm so grateful to you that you spent the time, and very grateful that we've had the friendship that we share, and hopes that it will keep going forward for many years. So thank you, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you,
Let me
everybody.
see. Let me see if I can find how to pause the. Oh, here we go.